3 blocks to the west, Henry Ford built the Model T. The car that put America on wheels emerged from a modest brick factory at 461 Piquette Avenue. And when Ford outgrew that building in 1910, the automotive revolution he started was just beginning to transform the neighborhood around him. Milwaukee Junction was not beautiful. It was functional. Rail lines from the Michigan Central Railroad carved through the district, creating a web of sidings and spurs that made it an ideal location for manufacturers who needed to ship product across the country and receive raw materials from distant suppliers. The neighborhood took its name from the junction of multiple rail lines that converged in this corner of Detroit, a transportation hub that would define the area's character for more than a century. By the time the Fisher brothers arrived from Norwalk, Ohio, the area had already attracted Cadillac, Packard, Studebaker, Brush, Hupp, Regal, Anderson Electric, and dozens of smaller firms experimenting with the future of transportation. Some of these names would become legendary. Others would disappear within a few years, unable to survive the brutal competition of the early automobile industry. The streets hummed with activity. Freight cars rolled through on sidings that connected every major factory to the National Railroad network. Smoke rose from foundries and machine shops. Workers poured in from neighborhoods across Detroit, speaking a babel of languages brought from Europe and the American South. This was the cradle of the automobile age, and at the center of it all stood the intersection of Piquette and Beaubien, where the future was being assembled one automobile body at a time. The Fisher family story begins not with automobiles, but with horse-drawn carriages. Lawrence Fisher and his wife, Margaret Thyssen, raised 11 children in Norwalk, Ohio, where Lawrence operated a blacksmith shop that built carriage bodies for customers throughout the region. 7 of those children were sons: Frederick John, Charles Thomas, William Andrew, Lawrence Jr., Edward, Alfred, and Howard. All 7 would eventually make their way to Detroit. The carriage trade was dying. Everyone in the business could see that the horseless carriage was the future, but the skills it required translated directly to the new industry: woodworking, metal shaping, upholstery, the assembly of complex structures from individual components. The Fisher brothers grew up in their father's shop, learning trades that had sustained their family for generations. They did not know that those trades would make them among the wealthiest industrialists in American history. Norwalk was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and family reputation mattered more than formal credentials. The Fishers were known as reliable craftsmen, people who delivered quality work on time and stood behind what they built. That reputation would follow the brothers to Detroit, where trust between suppliers and manufacturers often determined who won contracts and who went bankrupt. The skills they learned from their father were technical, but the values they absorbed were just as important: precision, reliability, and the understanding that a craftsman's name was only as good as his last piece of work. Frederick and Charles were the first to arrive in Detroit, finding work at C.R. Wilson Company in 1904. Wilson was a manufacturer transitioning from horse-drawn carriages to automobile bodies, and the company needed skilled craftsmen who understood both the old technologies and the new. Detroit in 1904 was a city of perhaps 300,000 people, growing rapidly as the automobile industry attracted workers from across the country and around the world. The brothers learned quickly. They observed how automobile bodies differed from carriage bodies, how the vibrations of an engine and the speeds of motorized travel required stronger construction and more careful attention to detail. They developed techniques that would later become standard practice throughout the industry. The transition from carriages to automobiles was not as simple as it might appear. A carriage body needed to withstand the relatively gentle motion of horse-drawn travel, the sway of a trotting horse, the occasional bump of a wheel over a stone. An automobile body faced entirely different stresses. Engines vibrated constantly, transmitting their tremors through the chassis into the body. Speeds of 20 or 30 miles per hour, unimaginable in a horse-drawn vehicle, amplified every road imperfection into a jarring impact. Braking forces that a carriage never experienced could twist and warp a body not designed to handle them. The Fisher brothers learned these lessons through trial and error, analyzing failures and developing solutions that their competitors had not yet discovered. What the Fisher brothers understood, perhaps better than anyone else in Detroit, was that early automobiles were not integrated machines. The chassis came from one manufacturer, the engine came from another, and the body, The part that customers actually sat in, touched, and showed to their neighbors could come from anywhere. Automakers in those early years did not have the capacity or the expertise to build their own bodies. They needed specialists who understood how to shape wood and bend metal into something that could withstand the punishment of unpaved roads while still providing comfort and style. The Fisher brothers saw an opportunity that few others recognized. They would not merely build bodies for other manufacturers. They would build the best bodies, and they would do it at a scale that no competitor could match. The body business in 1908 was fragmented and chaotic. Dozens of small shops competed for contracts, most of them employing fewer than 50 workers. Quality varied wildly. Delivery schedules were unreliable. Automobile manufacturers complained constantly about bodies that arrived late, bodies that did not fit their chassis properly, bodies that fell apart after a few thousand miles of use. The Fisher brothers saw this chaos as opportunity. If they could deliver consistent quality on a reliable schedule, they could capture market share from competitors who treated bodybuilding as a sideline rather than a specialty. On July 22, 1908, Frederick and Charles Fisher, with financial backing from their uncle Albert Fisher, who had established Standard Wagon Works in Detroit, formally established the Fisher Body Company. That same year, Henry Ford introduced the Model T. Within 5 years, automobile production in the United States would increase by a factor of 10. Their uncle Albert soon wanted out of the business, and the brothers turned to Louis Mendelssohn, a Detroit businessman who became a shareholder and director. With fresh capital and growing demand, Charles and Fred brought their 5 younger brothers into the business. A family enterprise was taking shape, one that would eventually employ more than 100,000 workers across 40 plants, spanning from Detroit to Cleveland to Flint to Ontario. The decision to bring all 7 brothers into the business was unusual for the time. Most family enterprises struggled with sibling rivalry and competing visions. But the Fisher brothers had grown up working together in their father's shop, where each had developed distinct skills and taken on different responsibilities. Frederick excelled at engineering and design. Charles understood finance and negotiation. William had a gift for managing workers and organizing production. The other brothers contributed their own talents. Together, they formed a management team that covered every aspect of the business, and their family bonds ensured a level of trust and communication that competitors organized along more traditional corporate lines could not match. The company's first years were marked by relentless innovation and aggressive expansion. Traditional carriage bodies required extensive hand-fitting, with each piece shaped to match its neighbors through time-consuming adjustments performed by skilled craftsmen. The Fishers developed interchangeable wooden body parts that could be assembled without individual fitting, dramatically increasing production speed while maintaining quality standards. This required the design of new precision woodworking tools and the development of standardized components that could be produced in volume. The approach established a pattern that would define Fisher Body for decades: innovation in manufacturing process, not just product design. By 1913, the Fisher Body Company had the capacity to produce 100,000 car bodies per year, an astonishing figure for a company that had existed for only 5 years. Their customer list read like a directory of early American automotive manufacturers: Ford, Cadillac, Studebaker, Chalmers, Crit, and many others. The concept of interchangeable parts was not new. Eli Whitney had demonstrated the principle with muskets more than a century earlier, but applying it to the complex curves and joints of automobile bodies required solving problems that had no existing solutions. A musket part was relatively simple: a trigger, a hammer, a barrel. A body panel was a 3-dimensional shape that had to match adjacent panels along curves that changed continuously. The Fisher brothers developed jigs and templates that allowed workers to produce identical parts without the years of training that traditional coach building required. They invested in machinery that could cut and shape wood to tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. They created inspection systems that caught defective parts before they reached the assembly floor. The transition from open-air automobiles to closed, all-weather bodies represented perhaps the most significant transformation in early automotive history. Before the Fisher brothers, automobiles were fundamentally outdoor machines. Passengers sat exposed to rain, snow, dust, and wind. Long-distance travel in inclement weather was an endurance test. Women in particular avoided automobile travel because the wind and dust ruined carefully arranged hairstyles, and the open exposure to weather was considered unladylike. A closed body changed everything. Suddenly, an automobile became a private space, a movable room that could transport passengers in comfort, regardless of weather conditions. The technology required to make closed bodies practical, weather stripping, sturdy door hardware, glass that could withstand road vibrations, was not trivial. The Fisher brothers mastered it. The social implications of the closed automobile body extended far beyond mere comfort. An open car was a public space. Everyone could see who was inside, what they were wearing, who they were with. A closed car offered privacy that had previously been available only in private carriages owned by the very wealthy. Middle-class families could now travel without being observed. Business could be conducted in transit. Couples could court without chaperones. The closed automobile body was not merely a technical innovation, it was a social revolution that the Fisher brothers enabled and profited from. Fred Fisher had built the first closed-body coupe while still working at C.R. Wilson Company. The 1905 Cadillac Osceola was a prototype commissioned by Cadillac founder Henry Leland to test whether a fully enclosed automobile was even feasible. It was, but the manufacturing challenges were immense. Closed bodies required more materials, more precise construction, and more sophisticated techniques than open touring cars. But the Fisher brothers saw the future clearly. As automobile ownership expanded beyond the very rich to the merely prosperous, demand for closed bodies would explode. The brothers invested heavily in the equipment and expertise needed to produce closed bodies at scale, positioning their company to dominate a market that did not yet fully exist. Starting in 1910, Fisher Body became the exclusive supplier of closed bodies for Cadillac, and soon added contracts with Buick, Oakland, and Oldsmobile. The relationship with Cadillac was particularly important because Cadillac had established itself as the quality leader in the American automobile industry. In 1908, the Royal Automobile Club of England had awarded Cadillac the Dewar Trophy for demonstrating that its parts were truly interchangeable, a feat that proved American manufacturing had reached a level of precision that European craftsmen had thought impossible. Association with Cadillac gave Fisher Body a reputation for quality that opened doors with other manufacturers. If Fisher Bodies were good enough for Cadillac, the reasoning went, they were good enough for anyone. By 1914, Fisher Body had grown into the largest manufacturer of automobile bodies in the world. The company's capacity reached 370,000 bodies per year, and its customer list expanded to include virtually every significant automaker in the country. Abbott, Buick, Cadillac, Chalmers, Chandler, Chevrolet, Churchfield, Elmore, EMF, Ford, Herreshoff, Hudson, Crit, Oldsmobile, Packard, Regal, and Studebaker. The expansion required vast quantities of raw materials. Before stamped steel bodies became the norm, automobile construction relied heavily on wood. Fisher Body owned 160,000 acres of timberland in Michigan and other states, ensuring a steady supply of the hardwoods needed for body frames. The company consumed more wood than any other manufacturer in the world, along with enormous quantities of carpet, tacks, thread, and other materials for interior trim. The logistics of supplying such a vast operation were staggering. Timber had to be harvested, transported to sawmills, cut into usable lumber, dried to precise moisture content, and shipped to body plants, all while maintaining quality standards that ensured the finished lumber would not warp or split after it was incorporated into a body. The Fisher brothers established their own lumber operations, vertically integrating in ways that gave them cost advantages over competitors who purchased lumber on the open market. They built drying kilns that could process lumber faster than natural air drying while achieving superior results. They developed relationships with railroad companies that ensured their shipments received priority handling. In 1916, the Fisher Body Company reorganized as the Fisher Body Corporation, reflecting its growth from a family enterprise into a major industrial firm. The company now operated more than 40 plants encompassing 3.7 million square feet of floor space. Production techniques were evolving rapidly. The shift from wood-framed bodies to all-steel construction was already underway, driven by the need for greater strength, improved fire safety, and lower production costs. Steel could be stamped into complex shapes using hydraulic presses, a process that required less skilled labor than traditional woodworking. The Fisher brothers invested heavily in new equipment, including massive stamping presses that could shape body panels from flat sheets of metal in a single operation. The transition to steel was driven partly by a series of devastating fires that struck automobile plants in the 1910s. Wooden body plants were tinderboxes. Sawdust accumulated everywhere, and the varnishes and paints used to finish bodies were highly flammable. A single spark could destroy an entire factory and kill dozens of workers. Insurance companies charged premium rates for wooden body plants, and some refused to insure them at all. Steel bodies were not fireproof, but they were far less likely to turn a small fire into a catastrophic conflagration. The safety advantages of steel reinforced the economic arguments for the transition. The rise of all-steel body construction represented a fundamental shift in the nature of automobile manufacturing. Wooden bodies required skilled craftsmen who had learned their trade over years of apprenticeship. Steel bodies, by contrast, could be produced by workers with minimal training operating sophisticated machinery. The skill resided in the equipment, not the operator. A stamping press did not care whether the man feeding it steel blanks had worked in the industry for 20 years or 20 days. This transformation had profound implications for the workforce. It enabled enormous increases in production volume, but also de-skilled labor and shifted power from workers to managers who controlled the machinery. The de-skilling of automobile work created a workforce that was increasingly interchangeable. A worker who quit or was fired could be replaced within days, sometimes within hours. This gave management enormous leverage in disputes over wages and working conditions. Workers who complained could simply be shown the door, knowing that dozens of others would eagerly take their places. The power imbalance would persist until workers found ways to organize collectively, but that organization was still 2 decades away. In the meantime, the Fisher Brothers and other manufacturers could set wages and working conditions largely as they pleased, constrained only by the need to attract enough workers to keep their plants running. William Durant, the aggressive and ever-restless president of General Motors, recognized that Fisher Body had become indispensable to GM's operations. Multiple GM divisions, Buick, Cadillac, Oakland, Oldsmobile, and the recently acquired Chevrolet, depended on Fisher for their closed-body production. In 1919, Durant orchestrated a deal that gave General Motors a 60% stake in Fisher Body Corporation. The purchase price was $27.6 million. Under the terms of the agreement, the Fisher brothers retained managerial control of their company and also became vice presidents within General Motors. They had built their company from nothing over 11 years, starting with borrowed money and ending with a valuation that made them among the wealthiest industrialists in the country. Durant was a visionary who had already assembled General Motors by acquiring dozens of automobile and parts manufacturers. But he was also a reckless gambler who would eventually lose control of the company he had built. His acquisition of Fisher Body was one of his better decisions. It secured GM's supply chain and brought talented managers into the GM orbit. The Fisher brothers, for their part, gained access to capital and markets that would have been difficult to reach as an independent company. The deal aligned interests in ways that benefited both parties, at least in the short term. The same year that General Motors acquired its controlling interest in Fisher Body, the company broke ground on a new factory that would become both a monument to industrial ambition and, decades later, a symbol of industrial decay. Fisher Body Plant 21 rose on Piquette Avenue in Detroit, just a stone's throw from Henry Ford's original workshop. The building was designed by the Detroit architectural firm Smith, Hinchman & Grills, though popular legend often misattributes the design to Albert Kahn. The confusion is understandable. Kahn's firm designed many Fisher Body plants, and his name became synonymous with Detroit industrial architecture. Smith, Hinchman & Grills was one of the oldest architectural firms in America, founded in 1853 when Detroit was still a frontier town. By 1919, the firm had designed hundreds of buildings throughout the Midwest, including factories, office buildings, and public structures. Their industrial work emphasized functionality over aesthetics, but functionality in 1919 incorporated ideas about worker welfare that earlier generations of factory designers had ignored. Windows provided natural light that reduced eye strain and improved morale. High ceilings and ventilation systems moved air through the building, reducing the accumulation of fumes and dust. Wide aisles and clearly marked exits improved safety in case of fire or other emergencies. The construction of Plant 21 featured reinforced concrete, a technology that had only recently become standard for industrial buildings. Concrete offered advantages that traditional wood or brick construction could not match. It was fire-resistant, crucial for a factory that would house welding operations and flammable materials. It could span large distances without intermediate supports, allowing for open floor plans that could be reconfigured as production needs changed. The walls contained hundreds of windows arranged in regular grids, flooding the factory floor with natural light. Plant 21 occupied 536,000 square feet of floor space spread across 6 stories. Heavy equipment could be placed anywhere on the floor without concern about overloading wooden joists. Overhead cranes could move materials from one station to another along rails embedded in the concrete structure. The building was designed to house industrial processes that were still being invented. The concrete itself was a marvel of contemporary engineering. Reinforced with steel rebar, it combined the compressive strength of concrete with the tensile strength of steel, creating a material that could bear enormous loads while remaining relatively lightweight. The concrete was mixed on site to exacting specifications, with the ratio of cement to aggregate carefully controlled to ensure consistent strength throughout the structure. Workers poured the concrete into wooden forms, then vibrated it to remove air pockets that could weaken the finished product. The forms remained in place for days while the concrete cured, then were stripped away to reveal the smooth gray surfaces that would define the building's appearance for the next century. Production at Plant 21 focused initially on bodies for Buick and Cadillac. The plant specialized in the stamping process, using massive hydraulic presses to shape flat sheets of steel into the curved panels that formed automobile bodies. Raw steel arrived at the plant in coils or sheets. Workers fed those sheets into presses equipped with precisely machined dies that formed the metal into specific shapes: fenders, roof panels, door skins, floor pans. Each press operation took only seconds, but the precision required was extraordinary. A die that was off by even a fraction of an inch would produce panels that did not fit properly when assembled. The investment in tooling for a new body style could run into millions of dollars. The dies themselves were works of industrial art, carved from massive blocks of tool steel by craftsmen who spent weeks shaping each surface to exact specifications. A single die might weigh several tons and require dozens of machining operations before it was ready for production. The die makers were among the highest paid workers in the plant. Their skills so specialized and so essential that they commanded wages far above those of ordinary production workers. They worked from blueprints that specified every dimension to thousandths of an inch, and they checked their work constantly with precision instruments that could detect errors invisible to the naked eye. The work was hot, loud, and dangerous. Press operators faced the constant risk of injury from machinery that could crush a hand in an instant. The hydraulic presses that shaped body panels operated with thousands of pounds of force, and a moment's inattention could result in catastrophic injury. The noise on the factory floor was deafening, a constant cacophony of metal striking metal as presses cycled through their operations dozens of times per minute. Workers communicated through hand signals because verbal communication was impossible over the din. Many developed hearing loss that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The heat generated by the presses, combined with the exertion of physical labor and the poor ventilation, made the factory floor uncomfortable even in winter. In summer, temperatures could exceed 100 degrees. Yet workers came to Plant 21 by the thousands, drawn by wages that exceeded what they could earn in most other occupations and by the steady employment that the automobile industry provided. For immigrants from Europe and migrants from the American South, factory work offered a path to the middle class that had been closed to their parents and grandparents. The workforce at Plant 21 reflected the diversity of early 20th century Detroit. Polish immigrants from the rural villages of Galicia worked alongside Italian immigrants from the slums of Naples. African Americans who had fled the Jim Crow South, seeking better opportunities, labored next to Appalachian whites who had left played-out coal mines for the promise of steady wages. Hungarians, Greeks, Ukrainians, Syrians. The plant was a babel of languages and cultures, united only by the need to earn a living and the shared experience of industrial labor. Foremen often could not communicate with their workers except through gestures and demonstrations. Signs in the plant appeared in multiple languages. The company hired translators to explain safety rules and production requirements to workers who spoke no English. The ethnic diversity of the workforce created both opportunities and tensions. Workers from the same background often helped each other find jobs and housing, creating networks of support that made the transition to industrial life easier. But ethnic rivalries that had festered in the old country sometimes flared in the new one, and foremen learned to keep certain groups separated to prevent conflicts. The company also exploited ethnic divisions, using the threat of replacement by workers from another group to keep wages low and discourage organizing. A Polish worker who complained about conditions might find himself replaced by an Italian willing to work for less. An Italian who pushed back might be shown the door while a Hungarian took his place. General Motors completed its acquisition of Fisher Body in 1926, purchasing the remaining 40% stake for $208 million. The seven Fisher brothers received a fortune that translates to approximately $2.5 billion in modern currency. Several of the brothers remained active in GM's management. Lawrence Fisher became president of Cadillac, where he would make one of the most consequential hiring decisions in automotive history. He recruited a young designer named Harley Earl to create the 1927 Cadillac and LaSalle, and Earl's work so impressed GM executives that he was appointed head of the company's new art and color section. The era of automobile styling, as distinct from mere engineering, had begun. Earl's appointment marked a fundamental shift in how automobiles were designed and sold. Before Earl, cars were designed primarily by engineers who focused on function. Appearance was secondary, almost an afterthought. Earl brought a different perspective. He had grown up in his father's custom coach-building shop in Los Angeles, where Hollywood stars ordered flashy cars designed to attract attention. He understood that for many buyers, a car was not merely transportation, but a statement of identity, a way of telling the world who they were and who they aspired to become. Under Earl's leadership, GM cars would become longer, lower, wider, and more flamboyant, setting styling trends that the rest of the industry would follow for decades. The Fisher brothers used their wealth to transform Detroit's physical landscape. The most visible legacy of their success was the Fisher Building, a magnificent 30-story Art Deco skyscraper on West Grand Boulevard that Albert Kahn designed and the Fisher family financed. Construction began in 1927 and was completed in 1928. The building featured an ornate lobby finished in marble and bronze, a theater that could seat 3,000 people, and office space that attracted the city's most prestigious tenants. The Fisher brothers had intended to build a second, even taller tower adjacent to the first, but the Great Depression intervened before construction could begin. The Fisher Building was designed to be the most beautiful commercial building in the world, and many who have seen it believe that it achieved that goal. The lobby alone contains 40 different varieties of marble, imported from quarries around the globe. Bronze fixtures and decorative elements were cast by craftsmen who spent months perfecting each piece. Murals depicting the history of transportation adorned the walls, connecting the building to the industry that had paid for its construction. The theater, originally called the Fisher Theater, hosted vaudeville shows and movies before being converted to a legitimate theater that still operates today. The building stands as testament to what industrial wealth could create when directed by men with ambition and taste. The prosperity of the 1920s came to a crashing halt in October 1929. Automobile sales, which had seemed to climb inexorably year after year, plummeted. Americans who had been planning to buy new cars suddenly found themselves unemployed or terrified of unemployment, and in no position to make major purchases. Factories that had operated around the clock fell silent. Workers who had earned decent wages found themselves on breadlines. The Depression hit Detroit harder than almost any other American city. The automobile industry, which had driven the city's growth for 2 decades, collapsed almost overnight. Employment at GM fell from a peak of more than 200,000 workers to barely 50,000. Ford, which had employed more than 100,000 workers at its River Rouge complex, cut its workforce to a fraction of that number. Parts suppliers, dealers, and the countless businesses that depended on auto workers' spending all suffered in turn. Banks failed. Homes were foreclosed. Families that had achieved middle-class stability found themselves destitute. Fisher Body Plant 21 suspended body production during the worst years of the Depression, and the building was converted to use as a soup kitchen and homeless shelter. The same floors that had supported stamping presses and assembly lines now fed desperate families who had lost everything. Men who had worked in the plant, or who had hoped to work there, now lined up inside it to receive food that charitable organizations provided. The transformation was a stark illustration of how quickly fortunes could change, how buildings designed for one purpose could be pressed into entirely different service. The soup kitchen at Plant 21 served thousands of meals daily at the depth of the Depression. Volunteers from churches and civic organizations staffed the operation, cooking in improvised kitchens set up on the factory floor. The men who came for food often wore their best clothes, trying to maintain dignity in circumstances that stripped dignity away. They sat at long tables where machinery had once stood, eating meals of bread and soup that were sometimes the only food they would have that day. Some had worked at the plant before the crash. They recognized the columns and windows, remembered where their stations had been, knew the building in ways that the volunteers serving them could not. For them, the soup kitchen was not just a source of food, but a reminder of how far they had fallen. The Depression years also brought the first stirrings of industrial unionism to the automobile industry. In 1935, a new organization called the United Automobile Workers held its first convention and immediately began planning an organizing campaign that would target General Motors. The union's strategists identified Fisher Body as the weak point in GM's production chain. Body plants supplied multiple assembly facilities, so a strike at a single body plant could shut down production at several assembly plants. The dies used to stamp body panels were enormously expensive, and only a few plants had the capability to produce bodies for specific car models. The union began organizing secretly, meeting with workers in their homes, in bars, in churches, anywhere but inside the plants where company spies would report their activities to management. GM had developed an extensive network of spies and informants to detect and disrupt union organizing. The company employed the Pinkerton Detective Agency and other firms to infiltrate worker meetings and identify union sympathizers. Workers suspected of union activity were fired without explanation, their names added to blacklists shared among employers throughout the industry. The atmosphere in the plants was one of constant surveillance and fear. Workers learned to trust no one outside their immediate circle of family and friends. They spoke in code about union matters, never knowing who might be listening. The paranoia was justified. GM's spy network was extensive and effective, and workers who were caught organizing often found themselves unable to get jobs anywhere in Detroit. The sit-down strike that began at Fisher Body Plant 1 in Flint, Michigan, on December 30, 1936, became one of the most significant events in American labor history. Workers had discovered that GM was secretly moving dies from the Flint plant to facilities where the union was weaker. Rather than walk off the job and set up picket lines outside, where they could be replaced by strikebreakers and attacked by police, the workers sat down at their machines and refused to leave. They occupied the factory, preventing GM from using the building or its equipment, and dared the company to evict them by force. The sit-down tactic was revolutionary because it neutralized the weapons that management had traditionally used against striking workers. Strikebreakers could not enter the plant because the strikers were inside. Police could not easily disperse a picket line when the picketers were behind locked doors. The machinery and dies that represented millions of dollars of investment were effectively held hostage. Any attempt to retake the plant by force risked destroying the very assets that made the plant valuable. The workers had found a way to turn management's investment in capital equipment into leverage for their own demands. The occupation was remarkable for its organization and discipline. Strikers established committees to handle food, sanitation, security, and entertainment. They held classes on labor history and union organizing. They staged theatrical performances and concerts to maintain morale during the long weeks of occupation. They slept on car seats and fashioned beds from materials found in the factory. They kept the production equipment clean and maintained. No alcohol was permitted inside the occupied plants, no gambling, no violence against company personnel or property. The workers understood that public sympathy was essential to their success. Women played a crucial role in supporting the sit-down strike, though their contributions were often overlooked in later accounts. The Women's Emergency Brigade, formed by wives and daughters of the striking workers, provided food and supplies to the men inside the plant. They organized around-the-clock pickets outside the factories, ready to sound alarms if police attempted to storm the buildings. When violence did erupt, the women were often in the front lines, their presence complicating the decision of police to use force. The brigade wore distinctive red berets and carried clubs, prepared to defend the strikers if necessary. Their courage matched that of the men inside the plants. The Flint sit-down strike lasted 44 days and spread to Fisher Body plants and GM facilities across the country. At its peak, more than 100,000 workers participated in the walkout, and 136,000 GM employees were idled as production ground to a halt. The company cut off heat to Fisher Body Plant 2 in an attempt to force workers out, but the strikers built fires inside the building to keep warm. When Flint police attempted to storm the plant on January 11, 1937, The workers inside fought back with fire hoses, door hinges, coffee mugs, and anything else they could throw. The police retreated. The battle became known as the Battle of Running Bulls. President Franklin Roosevelt urged GM to negotiate with the union, and Michigan Governor Frank Murphy refused to use the National Guard to evict the strikers. On February 11, 1937, General Motors recognized the UAW as the bargaining representative for workers at the struck plants. The Flint victory transformed American labor relations. Union membership exploded from 3.4 million workers in 1930 to 10 million by 1942. The benefits that auto workers won through collective bargaining, health insurance, pensions, paid vacations, job security provisions became standards that other industries eventually adopted, helping to create the great American middle class. The contract that ended the sit-down strike was just the beginning. Over the following years, the UAW negotiated successive improvements in wages, benefits, and working conditions. Health insurance became standard. Pensions provided security in retirement. Grievance procedures gave workers protection against arbitrary treatment by supervisors. Seniority systems ensured that layoffs fell on the newest workers rather than on veterans who had devoted years to the company. The power relationship between workers and management, which had been so one-sided before the strike, moved towards something closer to equilibrium. The approach of World War II transformed American industry as completely as the Depression had devastated it. President Franklin Roosevelt's call for America to become the arsenal of democracy required automobile manufacturers to convert their factories from civilian production to military manufacturing. Fisher Body, with its expertise in metal stamping and assembly, was ideally positioned to contribute. The company had produced aircraft during World War I, building trainers, Italian Caproni twin-engine bombers, and British de Havilland fighters at a facility on Fort Street in Detroit. The conversion from automobile production to military manufacturing was more complicated than simply retooling factories to build different products. Military specifications were more demanding than civilian ones. Tolerances that were acceptable for automobile parts were too loose for aircraft components that might fail under combat stress. Quality control procedures had to be redesigned. Workers had to be retrained. Supply chains that had been optimized for automobile production had to be reconfigured to deliver military-grade materials. The transformation took months, but when it was complete, the American automobile industry had become the most productive military manufacturing complex in world history. Fisher Body Plant 21 converted to military production in the early 1940s, manufacturing components for 5 different aircraft types. Stamping presses that had produced automobile body panels were reconfigured to stamp aircraft components. Workers who had spent their careers building Cadillacs and Buicks learned to build fighters and bombers. The plant produced parts for the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, the Vought F-4U Corsair, the famous gull-winged fighter that dominated Pacific air combat, and the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, the aircraft that Jimmy Doolittle's raiders flew off the deck of the USS Hornet for the first American strike on the Japanese home islands. Fisher Body earned the Navy E for excellence in production. Before converting to military manufacturing in 1942, Fisher Body had built more than 21 million automobile bodies. The war brought women into the workforce in numbers that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. With millions of men serving in the armed forces, manufacturers turned to women to fill jobs that had previously been reserved for men. At Fisher Body plants throughout the country, women operated stamping presses, welded components, and performed assembly work that required the same skills and endurance that male workers had brought to the job. They proved that the assumption underlying decades of employment discrimination that women could not perform heavy industrial work was simply wrong. Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol, and the reality behind the symbol was women like those who worked at Plant 21. The Fisher brothers themselves stepped away from active management during the war years. On August 14, 1944, the 7 brothers resigned from General Motors to devote their time to other interests. The Body by Fisher name and the iconic Napoleonic coach emblem would continue to appear on GM vehicles for decades. The coach, which had served as the company logo since 1922, symbolized the carriage-building tradition from which the Fisher brothers had emerged. After World War II ended, Fisher Body Plant 21 returned to civilian production, though not to its original role. The Buick bodywork had been consolidated at facilities in Flint, and Cadillac body production had moved to other plants. Plant 21 focused on stamping and assembly work for buses, ambulances, and limousines, specialized vehicles produced in smaller quantities. The plant also served as an engineering design facility from 1930 to 1956, developing new manufacturing processes and testing new equipment before deploying innovations to the high-volume factories. The post-war period brought challenges as well as opportunities. Workers who had grown accustomed to the solidarity of wartime production now faced management eager to reassert control. Women who had proven their capabilities during the war were pushed out of manufacturing jobs to make room for returning veterans. African American workers who had gained access to better-paying positions during the labor shortage found themselves relegated once again to the worst jobs. The gains of the war years were not entirely lost, but they were contested, and the contests would continue for decades. The 1950s represented the golden age of American automobile manufacturing. Domestic automakers faced essentially no foreign competition. The Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, dominated a market that seemed to grow without limit. General Motors' market share peaked at around 54% in 1954. Fisher Body Plant 21 specialized in Cadillac limousine bodies during this period, producing the elongated vehicles that served as transportation for corporate executives, government officials, funeral homes, and wealthy individuals. Limousine production was a craft operation within an industry that had embraced mass production. Each limousine required extensive hand finishing. The plant also served as a pilot build facility where new body designs were tested before being deployed to high-volume factories. The third-generation Chevrolet Camaro and Pontiac Firebird, the cars made famous by Knight Rider, were proven at Plant 21 before entering mass production elsewhere. The limousines that Plant 21 produced were monuments to American automotive excess. They stretched 20 feet or more in length. Their wheelbases extended to create passenger compartments that could accommodate sofas rather than seats. Partition windows separated the chauffeur's compartment from the rear, where passengers enjoyed amenities that would have been remarkable in a living room. Televisions, bars, telephones, climate control systems that maintained perfect comfort regardless of outside conditions. The craftsmanship required to build these vehicles was extraordinary. Workers fitted wood veneers with the precision of fine furniture makers. They upholstered seats in leather that had been selected and tanned to exacting specifications. They adjusted every component until the fit and finish met standards that mass production could never achieve. The Fisher Body division continued to innovate throughout the post-war decades. In 1959, Fisher Body engineers developed GM's first unibody automobile, the Chevrolet Corvair. Unibody construction integrated the body and frame into a single structure, offering advantages in weight, rigidity, and interior space. Fisher Body also developed the ignition interlock system and the first production airbag, both introduced in 1974, and created GM's first all-metric automobile, the Chevrolet Chevette. The prosperity of the 1950s and early 1960s masked structural problems that would eventually threaten GM's dominance. Decision-making was slow and bureaucratic. The assumption that Americans would always prefer large, powerful automobiles left GM vulnerable to competition from imports. Japanese manufacturers, initially dismissed as producers of cheap, unreliable vehicles, were steadily improving their quality and efficiency. The complacency of American automakers in this period was remarkable in retrospect. They controlled the largest and most profitable automobile market in the world, and they assumed that control would continue indefinitely. Foreign manufacturers posed no threat. Their cars were too small, too underpowered, too unfamiliar for American tastes. Labor costs were rising, but those costs could be passed along to consumers who had no alternatives. Quality problems multiplied, but buyers had no basis for comparison and accepted defects as normal. The seeds of decline were planted during the years of greatest success. The 1973 oil embargo exposed the vulnerability of American automakers. When Arab nations cut off oil exports to the United States, gasoline prices doubled, then tripled, and Americans suddenly found themselves unable to afford the operating costs of their large American cars. Demand for small, fuel-efficient vehicles exploded. Japanese manufacturers were perfectly positioned to meet that demand. The Chevrolet Vega, GM's response to the imported subcompact, became a symbol of everything wrong with American automobile manufacturing. The car's aluminum engine was prone to failure. The body rusted quickly. Quality problems multiplied. The Vega damaged GM's reputation precisely when the company needed to convince consumers that it could build small cars as well as large ones. The Vega's failures were not accidents but consequences of decisions made by GM management. Engineers had warned that the aluminum engine design was risky, but their concerns were overruled by executives focused on cost reduction. Quality control procedures that might have caught problems before cars reached customers were scaled back to meet production targets. Workers at the Lordstown plant where the Vega was assembled complained about the pace of work, which made careful assembly impossible. Management responded not by slowing the line, but by firing workers who complained. The result was predictable: a car that fell apart in customers' hands and destroyed whatever trust remained in GM's ability to compete with Japanese imports. Roger Smith became chairman and chief executive officer of General Motors in 1981, inheriting a company that was losing market share to foreign competitors. GM's share of the American automobile market had fallen from its 1954 peak of 54% to around 44%. Smith believed that automation and technology could solve GM's productivity problems, and he invested billions of dollars in robots, computer systems, and new manufacturing facilities. The reality proved more complicated. Smith's faith in technology was not entirely misplaced. Japanese manufacturers were indeed using automation to improve quality and reduce costs. But Smith misunderstood what made Japanese manufacturing successful. The advantage lay not merely in robots, but in systems that involved workers in continuous improvement, that detected problems early and fixed them at the source, that valued quality over quantity and long-term relationships over short-term profits. GM's automation investments addressed symptoms rather than causes, and the billions spent on robots often created new problems rather than solving old ones. Smith also reorganized GM's divisional structure in ways that proved catastrophic. In 1984, he eliminated Fisher Body as a separate division and redistributed its plants among newly created groups. The reorganization merged Fisher Body with GM Assembly Division to create two new manufacturing groups: Chevrolet Pontiac Canada and Buick Oldsmobile Cadillac. The reorganization was supposed to improve coordination, but it instead destroyed institutional knowledge that had accumulated over decades. The GM10 program, which was supposed to produce competitive midsize cars, became a case study in corporate dysfunction. Designs were delayed, quality problems multiplied, costs exceeded original estimates by billions of dollars. The dissolution of Fisher Body Division ended a name that had appeared on automobile door sills for more than half a century. The Body by Fisher emblem would continue to appear on GM vehicles until the mid-1990s, but the organization behind that emblem no longer existed. In November 1982, General Motors announced that Fisher Body Plant 21 would close. Limousine production would move to facilities in Flint. The announcement came as GM was shuttering plants across the country, trying to reduce capacity in response to declining market share. Detroit had already lost tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs as automakers moved production to newer facilities in the suburbs and in other states. The closure announcement was delivered in the antiseptic language of corporate communications. References to capacity adjustments and operational efficiencies that obscured the human reality of thousands of workers losing their livelihoods. For the workers at Plant 21, the announcement was a death sentence for a way of life. Some had spent their entire careers in the building, entering as young men and expecting to retire from the same job their fathers had held. Now they faced the prospect of unemployment in a city where good manufacturing jobs were disappearing faster than anyone could have imagined. The last day of production at Fisher Body Plant 21 came on April 1, 1984. Workers who had spent their careers building Cadillac limousines received their final paychecks and walked out of a building that many of them had entered as young men and women. Some had followed fathers and uncles into the plant. All of them now faced an uncertain future in a city where good manufacturing jobs were disappearing faster than new employment could be created. In 1985, a company called Carter Color Coat began operations in the building, providing electrodeposition coating services to automotive suppliers. The company employed perhaps a few hundred workers in a building that had once housed thousands. The painting operations created hazardous waste products that would eventually render the site one of the most contaminated brownfields in Detroit. When Carter Color Coat filed for bankruptcy in 1993, the company simply abandoned the building, leaving behind equipment, chemicals, and environmental problems that became the responsibility of whoever inherited the site. The abandonment of Plant 21 was not unusual in Detroit during this period. Throughout the city, companies walked away from properties when the costs of proper cleanup exceeded the value of the land. Environmental regulations that might have forced responsible closure were weakly enforced, and the penalties for abandonment were less than the costs of compliance. The result was a landscape littered with toxic ruins, buildings that could not be safely occupied or easily demolished, monuments to an industrial economy that had consumed resources without thought for consequences. The city of Detroit took ownership of Fisher Body Plant 21 in 2000 after years of unpaid property taxes. The building was readdressed as 6151 Hastings Street, but the city found itself custodian of a massive industrial ruin that it could neither use nor afford to clean up. The building sat at one of the most visible locations in Detroit, at the intersection of Interstate 75 and Interstate 94. Its deteriorating facade became a potent symbol of Detroit's decline. A 2004 survey by the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality cataloged the contamination within Fisher Body Plant 21. The findings documented contamination that would cost tens of millions of dollars to remediate. Investigators discovered asbestos materials throughout the building. Lead waste from decades of paint and metalworking operations contaminated surfaces throughout the structure. Further testing identified arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, cyanide, mercury, nickel, silver, thallium, and polychlorinated biphenyls in concentrations that pose significant risks to human health and the environment. The contamination discovered at Plant 21 was a catalog of industrial-era toxins. Asbestos, once prized for its fire resistance, had been sprayed on structural steel and wrapped around pipes, where it remained stable until disturbed, at which point it released microscopic fibers that lodged in lungs and caused cancers that might not appear for decades. Lead, used in paints and metalworking, accumulated in dust that settled on every surface. The heavy metals left behind by Carter Color Coat, chromium, cadmium, nickel, were carcinogens and neurotoxins that could contaminate groundwater and affect the health of anyone who came into contact with them. The Environmental Protection Agency initiated remediation work at the site in 2008, removing large quantities of contaminated soil, equipment, and underground storage tanks at a cost of more than $1 million, but this addressed only the most severe contamination. The Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy removed a leaking underground storage tank in 2010. A fire in October 2014 caused significant damage and injured a firefighter. The fire was ruled arson. It partially collapsed an elevator shaft, creating a dramatic visual of structural failure that photographers documented extensively. Fisher Body Plant 21 became one of the most photographed industrial ruins in America. Urban explorers documented the interior, photographing graffiti-covered walls, rusting equipment, and light filtering through broken windows. The blue-tinted glass on the upper floors created an ethereal glow that photographers found irresistible. The images circulated on websites dedicated to what critics called ruin porn. For residents of Detroit, the building represented something more personal than an aesthetic experience, a reminder of jobs that had disappeared, communities that had collapsed, and a way of life that had ended. Detroit's population, which peaked at 1.5 million in 1950, fell to barely 600,000 by 2020. The building became a location where police periodically found bodies, homeless individuals who had frozen to death, overdose victims, murder victims. It attracted trespassers, graffiti artists, photographers, and occasionally arsonists. In 2015, a German nightclub owner named Dimitri Hagemann expressed interest in converting it into a nightclub and hostel modeled on his famous Treasure Club in Berlin. The proposal did not move forward. The city of Detroit had been planning to demolish Fisher Body Plant 21 when developers Gregory Jackson of Jackson Asset Management and Richard Hosey of Hosey Development approached with an alternative vision. An $80,000 study they commissioned concluded that the building was structurally sound despite decades of neglect. In 2022, the city announced plans to sell the building to Jackson and Hosey for $1 million. The developers proposed transforming the structure into more than 400 apartments with retail and commercial space in a project they called Fisher 21 Lofts. The proposed development was described as the largest black-led development project in Detroit's history. The project would include 433 residential units, ranging from studios to three-bedroom apartments. 20% of the units would be offered at below-market rates to income-eligible residents. Ground floor retail space would activate the street level, and a 2-acre rooftop green space would provide outdoor amenities for residents. The financing relied in part on historic tax credits that required the building to retain its original character. The decision to cut 3 atriums through the massive floor plates to bring light into the deep interior required special permission from the National Park Service. The Detroit City Council approved a brownfield plan that would allow the developers to recoup approximately $25 million in environmental cleanup costs through reduced property taxes over 35 years. The Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy awarded a $1 million grant to support additional cleanup. The total cost of remediation was estimated at more than $31 million. The council also approved a community benefits agreement requiring the developers to contribute $500,000 to a community fund, ensure affordable units, and provide preferred access to jobs and commercial space for Detroit residents. Environmental provisions required dust control measures, air monitoring, and avoidance of transporting hazardous materials on residential streets. Neighborhood residents negotiated specific commitments, including rodent control requirements, sensitivity training for contractors and security employees, and partnerships with Detroit Public Schools for apprenticeship opportunities. Construction on Fisher 21 lofts proceeded through 2024 and 2025, with completion expected in summer 2026. Workers removed asbestos and lead, installed new mechanical systems, and converted industrial space into residential units while maintaining the exposed concrete columns and original window openings. The building that had built automobile bodies for 3/4 of a century was becoming a place where people would live. What remains of Fisher Body, beyond the real estate, is memory and legacy. The 7 Fisher brothers built a company that shaped the American automobile industry in ways that persist to this day, pioneering closed-body construction, developing manufacturing techniques that enabled mass production of complex metal structures, and creating designs that defined American automotive style for decades. Their success demonstrated what immigrant families could achieve in industrial America, rising from a carriage shop in rural Ohio to the pinnacle of American manufacturing in a single generation. The Fisher Building downtown, with its golden tower and ornate lobby decorated with 40 different varieties of marble, remains one of the most beautiful commercial buildings in America. The workers who built bodies at Fisher Body plants earned wages that supported families, purchased homes, sent children to college, and contributed to communities that depended on industrial employment. The sit-down strikes that Fisher Body workers joined in 1936 and 1937 helped establish the right of American workers to organize unions and bargain collectively, gains that transformed the relationship between labor and capital throughout the American economy. But Fisher Body also represents something more troubling about American industrial history. The same manufacturing processes that created wealth also created pollution that would persist for generations. The lead and asbestos that workers handled caused diseases, mesothelioma, lead poisoning, respiratory illness, that shortened lives and diminished health long after the factories closed. The costs of industrialization were not borne equally. Workers and their families suffered the health consequences, while the financial benefits flowed disproportionately to executives and shareholders who lived far from factory floors. The closure of Fisher Body Plant 21 in 1984 was one event in a larger process of deindustrialization that transformed American cities and devastated working-class communities. The forces driving that transformation, globalization, automation, corporate consolidation, shifting consumer preferences, were beyond the control of any individual company or community. But the decisions that corporate leaders made accelerated the decline and concentrated its costs on the people least able to bear them. General Motors could have invested in the technology and training that would have made American workers competitive with foreign manufacturers. Instead, the company sought short-term savings through plant closures and outsourcing. The question of what killed Fisher Body, competition or self-inflicted wounds, has no simple answer. Japanese imports disrupted the American automobile industry, but GM's response made things worse. Roger Smith's reorganization destroyed institutional knowledge accumulated over decades. The emphasis on short-term financial performance over long-term investment hollowed out capabilities that could not easily be rebuilt. Responsibility is distributed across decades and decisions that no single actor controlled. What is certain is that the era when American factories like Fisher Body Plant 21 dominated global manufacturing is over. The skills that made the Fisher brothers successful have been automated or outsourced. The jobs that supported working-class families for generations have largely disappeared. The communities that depended on those jobs have struggled to find alternatives. Fisher Body Plant 21 will soon house residents who work in healthcare, education, technology, and service industries. They will live in apartments carved from industrial space, surrounded by concrete that was poured when Detroit was the center of American industrial might. They will know, perhaps vaguely, that their building has a history, but that history will be something they read about rather than something they lived. The Fisher brothers built for permanence in an economy that valued change. They could not have foreseen that their factory would become a homeless shelter during the Depression, an aircraft parts plant during World War II, a contaminated ruin in the 21st century, and eventually an apartment building. They built to last, and their building has lasted, though not in the form they intended. Somewhere in those future apartments, someone will look out a window that has been there since 1919 and see the interstates that carry traffic through what was once the heart of American automotive manufacturing, and perhaps wonder what it was like when this building built the bodies of Cadillacs and Buicks, when 7 brothers from a carriage shop in Ohio proved that in America anything was possible.